Hello again, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County. I'm back to talk about insect pest management in high tunnels. And management of insect pests will be very important to produce a good crop within your high tunnels. One thing that has been shown by research over the past several years is that the high temperature environment and protection from environmental conditions inside of a high tunnel can lead to higher populations of some insect pests, like whiteflies and thrips and aphids, as well as caterpillar pests like hornworms and cabbage loopers, diamondback moths and the imported cabbage worm, as well as beetle pests like cucumber beetles. The most important tasks in managing insects in any production environment, and high tunnels especially, will be scouting for those insect pests, identifying the problems that you may have inside the high tunnel early. Effective scouting allows us to detect those problems very quickly before they can expand to cause significant damage to production. And insect pests, as well as diseases, are much easier to deal with, much easier to manage in production when the population of that pest is small. Additionally, being able to detect those problems early will allow for more options when we're choosing management techniques in order to deal with that pest. Really good example of that is in managing caterpillar pests. BT insecticides, which are very specific to control of caterpillars, are much more effective on caterpillar pests when they're applied at an early stage of development for the caterpillar. So if we can detect those populations early, we can use a far less intrusive method of control, as well as potentially using simple mechanical control or physical removal of the pest. Scouting for insect pests inside of a high tunnel should start as soon as the plants begin to grow and should continue throughout the growth of the plant. And generally speaking, I recommend scouting for insect pests at least once a week. And if pest problems have been located inside the high tunnel, we need to scout more frequently to monitor the populations of pests that are present. It's also very important to scout for insect pests following any application of a control, because we want to be able to determine how effective that control has been at reducing pest populations. In order to effectively scout for insects, it is very important that we understand the life cycle of the insects. We want to know the egg stage and immature stages and adult stages of that pest. It can be very important for things like whiteflies, where the immatures are immobile on the plant, but the adults are very highly mobile, and that has some significant impact on what effective controls we can use. We want to be aware when and where we can see damage on our plants from the particular insect pests we might have. And information from scouting allows us to determine how many pests are there and if an action is needed to manage that population. When scouting, it is very important to pay attention to the entire plant. The underside of leaves is particularly important for small insect pests like aphids or thrips or whiteflies, as well as small caterpillars. And also pay attention to shaded or protected areas or just around the landscape for the high tunnel, because that can lead to introduction of the pest into the high tunnel area. It's also important, again, to know your pest. We want to make sure that we're properly identifying the insects that we find, because that can be very important in determining what the most effective control is going to be. So it's important to familiarize yourself with the pests that are common to the plants that you're growing. And one resource that you have at your disposal is your county extension office. They'll be very pleased, just as I am, to help you in identifying any insect pests you find, as well as recommending effective control. It is important to keep in mind that the status of an insect as a pest is dependent on the population of that insect. So the more insects are present, the more damage you're going to see. And very rarely is it that a single or individual organism is going to cause significant or sufficient damage to be considered a pest. And the overall aim of management of pests is to reduce populations below a threshold where they cause damage. One of the principal ideas in integrated pest management is the use of an economic injury level. And sometimes in ornamental crops, we might also refer to an aesthetic injury level. And there is a level at which we're seeing some damage to the plants, but that damage doesn't cause enough economic harm to justify the application of a control. Once we reach that threshold where the damage being caused by the pest justifies the expensive management, that's when we want to apply controls. And it's very important that we keep an eye in mind of what levels of pest population are tolerable within the environment that we're growing in. One very effective tool for scouting that can be used, particularly for the winged adult stages of insects like aphids and thrips and whiteflies, as well as leaf miners or fungus gnats, is the use of sticky traps. These are just what they sound like. They're traps that have a glue material on them. These can be placed throughout the high tunnel area, and insects are attracted both to the color of the card and get stuck on the card. And this provides a very effective way that we can detect the appearance of these insects as they come into the high tunnel. It's very important that I say that sticky traps are not themselves an effective means of controlling insect populations, but they do allow us to detect those populations as they're entering the high tunnel, as well as get an idea of how that population is changing over time. As we see more of the insects showing up on the sticky trap, we can assume we have more of those insects within the high tunnel. So I want to mention some of the prominent insects that you may encounter in growing crops inside of a high tunnel. The first of these is aphids. Aphids are found on just about every crop to some extent, as well as many of the ornamental plants that we have in our landscapes. They are small, soft-bodied insects that have a piercing, sucking mouth part, very similar to a mosquito's. They stick that into the plant and draw out the plant sap. Oftentimes, you will see aphid populations managed by beneficial insects or diseases that affect the aphids. But it's important, particularly within the higher temperature environment of a high tunnel, that aphid populations can grow very quickly. It's also important that aphids are able to transmit a number of different viral plant diseases, and so aphid management is very important. And in scouting for aphids, it is very important to check on the underside of leaves and to catch those populations early where they're much easier to manage. Whiteflies are another very common insect that we'll find inside of high tunnels. These are white moth-like insects that are true bugs, very much like an aphid is. And they feed very similarly to how an aphid feeds as well, using a piercing, sucking mouthpart. It's very easy to detect the adults of whiteflies. They are very mobile and they fly around the plant very actively. So if you tap the plant and you see the small white flies around the plant, it's a very good indication that we have a whitefly population that's come in. One thing that I didn't mention talking about aphids is both aphids and whiteflies, as they feed on the plant, they exude a material we call honeydew, and that sugary substance will stay on the plant. Occasionally will result in the development of a condition called sooty mold, which is a fungus that feeds on that honeydew and can stick to the outside of the plant. While it's not feeding on the plant directly, that can cause a reduction in light interception by the plant and cause it not to thrive quite as well. It's also important that whiteflies, very similarly to aphids, can also transmit some very serious plant diseases that can negatively impact production. Control of whiteflies, because the mature whiteflies or the adults are very mobile, is often focused on controlling the immatures. Those are immobile on the plant. And so by effectively controlling the immatures, we can eventually manage the population of whiteflies completely. Thrips are another common insect we may encounter in high tunnels. These are also a very small insect. The flower thrips are quite common, and they damage plant leaves and flower buds by puncturing the plant, feeding on sap. And that'll often cause the leaves to curl and to take on kind of a silvery appearance. Because they are quite small, it can be somewhat difficult to see thrips without looking very closely. And so one way to sample for them is to place a white cloth or an index card beneath the plants and tap them onto that card. And you can tap the thrips out onto the card where you can see them a lot more effectively. Getting into our caterpillar pests that we may encounter, cabbage loopers are quite common. They are named for their very distinctive movement because they have two prolegs on the back. They have kind of an inching movement where they hunch over or loop as they move forward. Um, and they'll also occasionally rest by gripping plants, kind of holding their body up into the air. As a caterpillar pest, they are feeding on the leaves, causing defoliation, and they can be quite damaging to cabbage and to other crucifer crops. Occasionally, the young caterpillars, being much smaller, will feed on the leaves, leaving the sort of transparent upper epidermis of the leaf intact, which is a condition on the leaf that we call window painting. A much larger caterpillar pest is the hornworm, much larger in terms of its individual size. And these are relatively easy to identify because the caterpillars are quite large in size. You can see that measured against a hand. They also have a very distinctive horn on the rear of their body. And because of their large size, particularly later in the development of the caterpillar, they can consume quite a lot of leaf tissue very quickly, completely defoliating plants. And they will also feed on the fruit of the plant as well, causing direct damage to the crop. Occasionally, you will see hornworms attacked by parasitic wasps. You can see that in the picture down on the bottom of this slide, where the parasitic wasp has laid eggs into the caterpillar. And those eggs the larvae have fed on the caterpillar and have come out onto the surface to pupate. Cucumber beetles, there are several different cucumber beetles. There is the 12-spotted cucumber beetle, banded cucumber beetle, and striped cucumber beetle that all feed relatively similarly and are very common on cucurbits as well as on legumes. And they feed very heavily on leaves. They can also scar the surface of the fruit, as you see in the picture there at the top right. So in the approach to managing pests in high tunnels, we want to take the approach of integrated pest management. So we want to use a number of different management techniques in concert to provide effective control. And that really begins with cultural control, with the selection of resistant plants when those are available. Certainly, we want to pay attention to plant resistance to disease, which can help us in terms of managing aphids and whiteflies, reducing the possibility of problems associated with those pests. Exclusion is a very effective method of managing insect pests. That's just providing a physical barrier between the insect and the plant. Removal of alternative hosts is just removing weeds which may serve as other sources for the insects to feed on, where they may then come into our production. Use of beneficial insects is a possible control method we can use. And of course, pesticides will be a very important part of control of insects in high tunnels. To begin with, exclusion again just provides a physical barrier between the insect pests and the plants. One thing that we have as a high tunnel, of course, we have the end walls and the side walls, which come up and down, which at times provide a direct exclusion of any insects that might be trying to come into the high tunnel area. But as we lift those, we lose that exclusion effect. And so the use of shade cloth between 30 and 50% on the side walls under that roll of plastic, as well as on the ends, can serve to exclude large insects while still allowing ventilation to cool the high tunnel area. So in total, as you apply that, that shade cloth material winds up covering 25% to about a third of the entire structure. And that exclusion reduces, it won't fully eliminate the potential for pest population. There are a couple of things to consider when we think about the use of these netting as a method for exclusion. First of all, of course, we are also excluding any potential beneficial insects that may come into the high tunnel. But we also want to make sure that when we place that netting there, we aren't trapping any of those pest insects in with our crop. And so it's very important to place that netting on the high tunnel prior to the establishment of the crop to avoid trapping the pest in with your plants. Because we have a functionally enclosed structure, we can use biological control in high tunnels very effectively and very similarly to how we would use that in a greenhouse. And principally, augmented biological control is just the release of insect predators or insect parasitoids, which can reduce the populations of any pest insects we may have, can be particularly effective in management of small insect pests like aphids. When we compare this with with a fully outdoor crop, often these sort of augmented biological control methods aren't very effective because we aren't maintaining that high population of the beneficial insect in that small area. By having the exclusion cloth as well as having the high tunnel, we keep those beneficial insects in there with the pest, and they can very effectively reduce that population. There is kind of contrasting to augmented biological control, their conservation biological control, where we include plants that are very good hosts for beneficial insects, conserve areas where they may develop in the area around the high tunnel to allow them to then move into the high tunnel to control any insect pests. Speaking of the area around the high tunnel, it is very important to maintain good weed management around your high tunnel, because some of the weeds that may grow in the area around the high tunnel can serve as alternate hosts for insects. So by controlling those weed species, particularly early in the year, we can prevent buildup of that population that then may move on to our crop. Some good examples of this, probably the best one I think is horse nettle, that serves as an important alternate host for flea beetles that could then move into the crop. Similarly, lamb's quarter serves as an alternate host for corn earworm, which is also occasionally known as the tomato fruit worm, which is certainly a pest we don't want to get into our production area. And a range of other plants like sunflowers can serve as a host for whiteflies. So removing any potential alternate hosts around the area of the high tunnel 2 weeks prior to planting can very effectively help manage some of those insect pests. Of course, the use of pesticides will be a very important element in managing insect pests. In the selection of pesticides, it is very important that we use a pesticide that is labeled for the crop that we are applying it onto, as well as for the pest we are managing, we are attempting to control. All of that information is going to be on the label for that pesticide. And of course, following the label is very important to maintain an effective pest control strategy as well as for the safety of the people applying the pesticides. It's also important to understand high tunnels are considered enclosed structures for the purpose of the use of pesticides. And so the label requirements may be different for an enclosed structure than they will be for open field applications. And it's very important, particularly in the protective equipment that you may need to wear, as well as what the re-entry interval is or the ventilation requirements before you go back in to do any further work in the crop. And again, the simply the important information here. You want to make certain that we have a good identification of the pest we're trying to manage, as well as a good recommendation on what the best pesticide for use in managing that pest will be. And I encourage you, whenever you have any questions regarding this, that you get in contact with your county extension agent. They'll be a very important resource to you, both in the identification of pests as well as in making control recommendations for you. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I will be very pleased to take them.